I've got an early copy of the new monster manual, so of course, I painstakingly compared every last one of the 500 stat blocks with the old ones from 2014. Let's see how the new monsters stack up. I'll be completely transparent with you here. I'd originally planned on making a video showcasing my favorite monster changes for every one of the 14 monster types. And while I was absolutely thrilled with some of those changes, there were actually a few categories that, didn't change much. A fair portion of these stat blocks are straight up reprints of their 2014 counterparts with just one or two numbers changed around, seemingly in order to claim that they're completely rebalanced to perfection. So, in a way, it's not just what they changed, but also what they didn't change. Still, I can't overstate the positives overall. I actually struggled to decide on my new favorite mechanics for most of the monster types. That said, I'll mainly focus on the most powerful variants of each creature in order to show off everything they're capable of. But there are a ton of lower CR options that are just as well designed for your party of tier 1 delinquents, like the Mind Goblin, for example. And speaking of psychic damage, we're going to kick things off with Aberrations. This is one of the most recognizable kinds of monsters, with entries like the Aboleth, the Mind Flayer, and the Beholder all receiving some pretty big changes. They got more hit points, more flavorful attacks, and the Beholder in particular now uses a bonus action for their anti-magic cone, so you can't just hide in plain sight to avoid their eye raids anymore. Get disintegrated, idiot. But none of those changes were what I want to show you today. Instead, I want to take a close look at the Death Slaad. Ducking autocorrect.
I'm Ron Burgundy?
I've literally never run Slaadi in my games, and yes, apparently that is the plural of Slaad. Their flavor and lore was really grotesque and intimidating, but the stat blocks were just meh. Now, when we take a look at the CR10 Death Slaad, we can really see them embodying their wild and impulsive flavor. They've got more hit points, movement speed, and speak common. But mainly, you'll notice that their old bite, claw, and greatsword attacks have all been condensed into one really intriguing Chaos Blade attack. A creature hit by this takes some slashing and necrotic damage, but they'll also be subjected to one of 4 random conditions with no saving throw. This kind of alteration is pretty consistent across a lot of monsters in the new monster manual, wherein attacks inflict conditions like poisoned, prone, grappled, and more without requiring an additional save. I really like this update as a way to make combat more nimble while also giving creatures a better chance to actually do all their cool stuff. But the Death Slaad takes this to the extreme, since they can make this attack twice per turn, each with a chance to charm, frighten, poison, or incapacitate their targets. By comparison, the old version was usually just a spiky frog with teeth, even though it did also have spellcasting access. The new Slaad has improved that too. Not only is spellcasting in general a lot easier to read with slimmer options, but some of the spells even include upcast versions. The old Death Slaad could cast Cloud Kill once per day, but the new one can cast Cloud Kill at level 6 and Blight at level 8. That's a 6d8 AoE spell and a 12d8 single target that'll actually make you want to use this creature's spellcasting now. And these slimmed down options really start to draw your eye towards some of this creature's combo potential too. High CR Slaad have blind sight, so they can attack creatures stuck in their Cloud Kill while they wait for them to run out of it. These creatures can even use their Shapeshift ability as a bonus action now. So once a party is stuck within their Toxic Deluge, the Death Slaad might change themselves to look like one of the party members and confuse them even further. These kinds of mind games weren't really possible with the old stat block that required a full action and concentration in order to change shape. This move to give creatures more conditional bonus actions is a strategy you'll see a lot in this video, and one that I'm a huge fan of. There's even more that we could spend time unpacking here, like how lower level Slaadi can lay eggs in the bodies of their victims with just their attacks, or they can just change their victims into Slaadi themselves.
Oh, damn it, now I'm Slaadi.
But we've got a lot of other monsters to look at, and they didn't all get the same incredible glow up, unfortunately. When it came to looking over the beast stat blocks, I didn't really expect much. I rarely do. One of my least favorite parts of D&D monster design stems from the fact that nearly every creature with any hint of magical or otherworldly flavor is classified as a monstrosity instead. Without going on too much of a subjective rant, I do understand their approach to the lore and flavor of these more outlandish creatures. But that doesn't mean beast stat blocks need to be boiled down into bland attacks with a total lack of extra traits. In my full monster manual review, I cited the black and brown bears as examples of both good and bad redesigns. After looking more closely, I can see that most of the beasts, especially the ones that would qualify for wild shape, received hardly any changes at all. Mainly, these new versions have slight adjustments to movement speed and senses, and many lost traits that gave them advantage on certain checks in favor of proficiency instead. Sure, it can be hard to find room to fit extra mechanics on such low CR monsters, but there were a few that got it right, at least in my opinion. The lion in particular is a great example of what's possible with just a little extra creativity. Here the creature loses a few hit points and gains dark vision while retaining their fantastic 50-foot movement speed at just CR1. However, the new lion also gets to keep its somewhat situational running leap and its valuable pack tactics feature for advantage on attacks when allies are within 5 feet of its target. What I really like about this new version is that we get a new multi-attack that features 2 vastly different options. First, you've got a basic damage-dealing rend attack for an average of 7 slashing damage. Not much to write home about, but it gets the job done. Then the new stat block presents the roar attack, wherein the lion imposes a wisdom save on a creature within 15 feet against being frightened. That effect only lasts until the start of the lion's next turn, and the DC for the save is only 11, but it should be. This is just a CR1 creature after all. More importantly, the mechanics paint a vivid picture here where I think a lot of other low CR beasts just don't. Maybe the black bear can use an action to find a few good berries once per day. Maybe the hawk can deal more damage if it uses all its movement speed to dive straight down at a target. And maybe the plesiosaurus can make more than 1 bite attack each round at CR2. If you like some of these ideas and the concept of more fantastical options for wild shape, consider becoming a member of the channel to get access to our monthly homebrew, where I've been putting out the occasional stat block for our own resident druid. And if not, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for free. Every bit of interaction helps out a lot, and I really appreciate you being here, regardless. But now let's move on and have a look at the strongest monster so far in my pick from the Celestials, the Solar. While the Empyrean technically sits at the top of the Celestial food chain, I wanted to cover the Solar here for a few key reasons. As you might guess, the new version gets some extra hit points, but it also gets a ridiculous plus 20 to initiative rolls. If it had that before, WotC definitely forgot to tell us. It does also lose all of its saving throw proficiencies, although its base stats are so good that it may not feel that much different. Especially with its advantage on spell saves and 4 brand new legendary resistances per day. Actually, a lot of the high CR creatures got extra legendary resistances in exchange for most of their ridiculous saving throw bonuses. I think this was done in order to simplify running some of these high level creatures so the DM can just say, no, they pass, instead. It may work to that end, but I have to say, I don't really like it. Prior to this new approach, finding the right saving throw to target was a bit of a mini game within combat. That's probably still the case now, but it's certainly not as drastic. They also swapped out the Solar's necrotic immunity for radiant immunity, and you'll notice that they no longer are resistant to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage from non-magical attacks. This is another change that you'll see across pretty much every stat block in the book, and this time, I'm glad for it. Damage resistance and immunity from non-magical attacks has always been a pain in the ass to keep in mind, and it wasn't really that flavorful to begin with. Getting rid of this standard even gives certain martial classes a bit of a boost, and if they're fighting this, they're gonna need it. The new Solar has a much simplified flying sword attack without the clunky mechanics of tracking the sword's position. More importantly, there are some big changes to its slaying bow attack. Instead of an attack roll, it imposes a DC 21 dexterity save with a whopping 600-foot range. For anyone unfamiliar, the attack automatically kills a creature with 100 hit points or fewer and deals roughly 60 damage otherwise. I'm not talking about falling unconscious and rolling death saves either. You just die. Against a creature with 150-foot fly speed and multiple 60-foot teleports per round via legendary actions, you're gonna have a really hard time pinning them down too. Even without legendary actions, the Solar can launch their sword from 120 feet away, snipe someone dead with their bow, and use their bonus action to cast a 2nd level Cure Wounds on themselves each turn. So even when you do get some damage in, they're probably just gonna fly away and start healing themselves while they blast you at range. This serves as yet another example of how adding some situational bonus actions to these creatures makes them a lot more challenging while ensuring that their spellcasting feature actually gets used. The Solar does still have some action-based spellcasting too, but a lot of that has been slimmed down, so it's clearer that those options aren't really meant for combat. And even if you do manage to take one down, the Solar has a new trait that sees them reborn automatically unless they're killed in Mount Celestia. Admittedly, I don't know how much this trait will actually play into your games, even though WotC saw fit to add this to a ton of high-level stat blocks. Regardless, all of these updates take the decent high-level encounter that this used to be and make it worthy of being one of the strongest creatures in the entire book at CR 21. The stat blocks for constructs, on the other hand, were mostly set in stone. But what they did change makes a huge difference for creatures like the Stone Golem.
Show me what you got!
The last time I ran a few of these in a combat, it actually felt like they were hitting way below CR 10. My players deftly locked them down with mind whips and clever positioning, so there wasn't much that I could do to challenge them. In particular, the Stone Golem now gets a boost to AC and hit points, loses its immunity to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, and gains a ranged attack that deals a nice amount of force damage. What I like the most, however, is the decision to move their slow attack from an action into a bonus action. Before, I felt compelled to use this attack as often as I could so the Golem didn't feel like just another bland encounter. As a result, I missed out on a lot of early damage. But now I can do both. Multi-attack and slow, at least for one round, since the slow attack is a recharge ability and only comes back about 30% of the time. I love this design philosophy because it encourages you to show off what the Stone Golem is capable of without making it so debilitating that the stat block becomes overpowered. Not to mention that the actual attack just casts the slow spell, so it's a lot stronger than before too. Now, how in the nine hells am I supposed to pick just one dragon to cover? As you can imagine, a lot of focus was put on updating dragons so they felt more unique and powerful in most cases. Still, a lot of the changes they made were pretty consistent across dragons of every variety. First of all, they'll get more legendary resistances and legendary actions if they're within their lair, now that lair actions have been pretty much done away with. Lairs themselves do still have their own flavor abilities outside of stat blocks though, so I'm mostly happy with this simplification. The Ancient Green Dragon's lair, for example, creates effects within 1 mile where tiny beasts spy on intruders and characters may become poisoned after finishing a long rest. And thankfully, dragons also no longer have the trademarked Frightful Presence ability, which was some of the worst copy pasta between multiple stat blocks that I've ever seen. Instead, many of them now have access to spellcasting with flavorful options that tie directly into their multi-attack. Some of them, like the Ancient Metallic Dragons, even have access to multiple breath weapons. One that does damage over a 90-foot area with a recharge, and one that serves as a debuff that can be used every single round as part of the dragon's multi-attack. Ancient Silver Dragons in particular have a pretty cool paralyzing breath with graduating effects that occur after you fail the saving throw more than once. What does it say about me that I keep trying to fight lawful good creatures? I don't know, and it's probably not worth reading into. And even though their redundant bite, claw, and tail attacks got consolidated into a single flavorless rend attack, I do feel like these changes overall were for the better. In similar fashion, some of the elementals in this book received consistent changes across each of their 4 variants: earth, fire, wind, and water. But quite a few of them were relatively unchanged coming from 2014. In particular, the ones with the word elemental actually in the name. So the monster I'll cover here is the Dao, because I've always liked earthbending, and definitely not because it was the first genie I came across in the book. A lot of the changes to this creature are consistent with what we've seen so far. More hit points, consolidated spell casting, more flavorful attacks with an extra ranged option. But their old sure-footed ability that gave them advantage against being knocked prone has been replaced with something completely new. Now, every one of the genie's stat blocks has a 30% chance of knowing the wish spell. Those that do can cast it up to 3 times on behalf of another creature before losing the spell for 365 days. Do I think that DMs are really going to roll percentile dice to determine if a genie knows the wish spell? Probably not. Instead, I see this as a potential story element that DMs can put into their campaigns. Maybe the party comes into contact with a genie that has just 1 wish left. Maybe the big bad evil guy used the first 2 wishes before the genie defected, and maybe the party has to convince the genie to let them use that last wish for good. Whatever the case, I'm here for it. While I wish there were more features like this, WotC did add quite a few traits to these new stat blocks that serve as built-in plot devices, and I'm pretty happy with that. But first, I have a bit of a confession to make. I tried really hard to find a good phase stat block to show all of you, and there were quite a few I could have used. But surprisingly, I've landed on one of my least favorite creatures in all of D&D, the Centaur. Listen, I don't know why they bother me. Half human, half horse should be the same as a cat person or a fish person in theory. But I like those, and I don't like these. I don't know what else to say. At the very least, I do like what the designers did for the new bonus actions of centaurs. Both of them are recharge abilities that deal damage and inflict conditions based on movement. The Centaur Warden, for example, can move up to 50 feet without provoking opportunity attacks. During that move, they can force every creature they run past to make a strength save against some bludgeoning damage and the restrained condition until the end of that creature's next turn. This is way better than the old trait that just added a bit of extra damage to an attack after the Centaur moved a certain distance. Who knows, maybe I'll finally put a Centaur into one of my sessions. Or maybe I'll just steal this design for something else. In the meantime, let's look at a slightly less cringe humanoid animal in the Arcanaloth. Arcanaloth? There are a lot of creatures that fall into the Fiend category, including both devils and demons. But even with all of those classic baddies, I was absolutely blown away by the design on this one. First, the Arcanaloth doesn't just get a boost to hit points, it has almost double what it had before. Their old teleport action has also become a bonus action so that it actually gets used now, and you can bet they'll be doing that every single turn. This new version can even cast Counterspell as a reaction now. Yes, it could do that before, but it's actually listed now as a reaction. You cannot possibly look me dead in the eyes and tell me that you never forgot a creature had Counterspell. It's okay, you don't have to lie. You're among friends. I knew it, Pinkertons get 'em. In all seriousness, I love even these slight format changes that make complex creatures easier to run. But we still haven't touched on my favorite change to the Arcanaloth. Within the traits section of the stat block and some others like it, you'll find that every Arcanaloth carries a soul tome with its own AC, hit points, and damage immunities. This soul tome allows the creature to make a special attack as part of its multi-attack. Banishing Claw is far more powerful than the basic Fiendish Burst because it can completely seal away a creature that fails a DC 17 Charisma saving throw after being hit. Naturally, players are going to want to get rid of that spell tome as soon as possible in order to avoid this possibility. But the tome is destroyed if it's dealt 35 points of damage, and it regains all of its hit points at the end of every turn. Not just the Arcanaloth's turn, every turn. I absolutely love this mechanic and the tactical flavor that it brings to combat. But even more so, I love how it changes the Arcanaloth from the boring, weak spellcaster that it was before into an imposing enemy with a strong foundation of features and some extra spellcasting utility sprinkled on top. And speaking of big changes, it's time to take a look at the giants. Truly, there were some pretty noteworthy changes here, and I was tempted to cover entries like the Cloud Giants with their Misty Step bonus action, or the Cyclops with their Portent reaction. But I think what stood out the most was what they did to Trolls. The Troll was already a pretty well-liked and well-known stat block for most tables, and I don't think anyone would have faulted WotC for just reprinting it. Instead, they added hit points, a movement-based bonus action, a whole new feature, and a whole new creature that adds another layer to this kind of encounter. Up to 4 times per day, if a bloodied troll takes at least 15 points of slashing damage during a turn, the troll loses a limb. That limb then has its own stat block that acts independently, and the original troll regrows its limb when it regains hit points, which should be pretty often if you know anything about trolls. If the limb isn't destroyed within 24 hours, then it has a roughly 8% chance to turn itself into a new troll. With how often these creatures linger in their bloodied state using their regeneration ability, I'd say it's pretty likely that most parties will get to see this in action. Even if that regeneration is shut off when the troll takes fire or acid damage now, rather than just fire like before. And after all that fresh flavor, it feels weird to take a turn towards the bland humanoid stat blocks that most people forget about. But unlike what the designers did to beasts, there are actually a lot of great changes and new entries in the humanoid category. If you watched my monster manual review, then you already know that I'm pretty happy with these. Even so, there was one improvement that stood out so massively that I just had to highlight it. Mages in the 2014 rules were pretty useless. Every once in a while, you might get off a cone of cold before the party could deal 40 points of damage to this CR6 wet noodle. But, for the most part, they died well before then. The new CR6 mage now has 81 hit points. They always have mage armor, so their AC is automatically set to 15 instead of 12. They have a bonus action Misty Step, and they have a reaction that allows them to cast either Counterspell or Shield. Again, they were technically able to cast those before, but it was very easy to overlook. No one would blame you if you did. And you definitely did. Their spellcasting, of course, was condensed and simplified too, but my favorite change comes in the form of their basic attacks and multi-attack. Before, mages only had one melee attack.
Oh no, dagger! Oh.
Now, mages have an arcane burst attack that they can use outside of their spellcasting for opportunity attacks, or if they run out of spell slots for some reason. This can be a real menace in the backlines, as a mage should be. And if anything, this feels like it could even be stronger than CR6 if played well. The Archmage stat block gives even more options like a level 9 Cone of Cold and a level 7 Lightning Bolt, as well as more attacks and longer range on their Arcane Burst. Even though this is my favorite improvement to humanoids, I can't say how happy I am with the rest of them. They did a really good job here. And they did some decent work on Monstrosities too. The Umber Hulk has a cleaner bonus action implementation of its confusing gaze. The Owlbear has a new primeval version with new attacks and a 5-foot fly speed. Hell, even the Tarrasque got an upgrade with a ranged attack, so no more archery XP farming. But I think my favorite example has to be the Bullet, D&D's own burrowing land shark. The last time I ran a couple of these, they performed fairly well, but felt pretty repetitive pretty quickly. With only 2 possible actions and their 40-foot burrow speed, I felt like the stat block did everything it could do in the first round and then was just waiting to be defeated. Really, they didn't need much, just a little pizzazz. That slight boost starts with 2 bite attacks instead of just 1 that'll make better use of knocking creatures prone and chomping on them with advantage. But they've also got 120 feet of Tremor Sense instead of just 60 feet in order to account for their new bonus action. The Bullet now gets a leap bonus action that allows them to spend 10 feet of movement in order to jump 30 feet, an ability that I've seen on other new stat blocks like the Hezrao and Lamia. This, combined with the net 10 feet that they get from their improved Deadly Leap attack, gives the Bullet an easy 70 feet of movement every round at just CR5. And most importantly, it gives the Bullet an awesome way to leap out of the earth and snap their jaws at flying creatures too. It's nothing too crazy, but it doubles down on what the creature does best while opening the door for some truly memorable moments. There's even a smaller version of this monster now in the Bullet Pup for those of you that want to give your adventuring party a pet, or just make them feel bad about making it an orphan. Next, I want to take a look at one of my all-time favorite creatures, the Gelatinous Cube, but for a completely different reason. There are only 6 Oozes in this book, and about half of them are new stat blocks entirely. The other ones didn't really see much change, sadly. I at least expected to see some love thrown at this insanely popular monster, but instead, oh, wait, they did change it. The Gelatinous Cube now has about 20 less hit points, immunity to acid damage, and does less damage to creatures stuck inside it. Neat. Look, I know the Gelatinous Cube is just a CR2 monster, so I can see why they felt like these changes were warranted. But I kind of feel like getting trapped and having to fight your way out was the whole point. Having less staying power in general is probably going to mean that the cube only gets to be a threat for a round or 2 before the party eventually defeats it. At least it's not as bad as what they did to some of the plants in this book. Specifically, I want to bring your attention to the Blights, a group of plants that generally relied on surprising their enemies in order to be effective. There were some slight changes to each of the individual stat blocks, and even a new creature introduced in the Gulthius Blight, a monster I may highlight more of in a future video. But the main change that has me twigging out is the removal of the false appearance trait. And I'm not just talking about its removal from the Blights, I mean from the entire book. Other creatures like the Cloaker and the Gargoyle got hit with this alteration too, and I think it really hurts their performance in combat. I imagine the thought behind this change likely stems from the new surprise rules. In the old rules, creatures like this might have been able to let loose a full batch of attacks on the party before they could ever fight back. Now, even with some extra hit points, it's likely that weaker blights will just be snapped in half or burned away before they have a chance to do anything. I wish, at least, that they might have given these creatures a larger bonus to initiative or some trait that gave them advantage on the roll. Instead, pretty much across the board, blights and other creatures like them just lose out on one of their most evocative aspects without much of anything in exchange. But before we bury the blights, let's unearth the most timeless enemy in all of D&D, the Lich. The old Lich performed well under its lofty CR21 status with just 17 AC, 135 hit points, and a really big reliance on high-level spells and legendary actions. Most of the time, you needed to run quite a few minions, or at least create circumstances to keep your players from being able to attack the Lich right away, lest you end up with a really anticlimactic finish to your campaign. The new Lich has a much improved 20 AC, a plus 17 to initiative, and a massive boost up to 315 hit points. That alone is going to make a huge difference, and that's before we consider that the Lich got to keep its massive saving throw bonuses in addition to some extra legendary resistances. Now you're gonna have to look at this ugly mug for a lot longer than you did before. Of course, the Lich will still have plenty of spells to rely on, including Counterspell and Shield, as well as offensive bangers like Power Word Kill, Finger of Death, and Chain Lightning, to name a few. But what I'm most excited about is actually an upgrade for the Lich's base attack option, Paralyzing Touch. The attack still doesn't do all that much damage, but if it hits, it'll paralyze its target until the start of the Lich's next turn without a saving throw. And now the Lich can make this attack up to 3 times per turn with its multi-attack rather than just once. By combining this with the Lich's new teleport legendary action, DMs may even want to march their Undead Master of Magic directly into danger. They just might paralyze half the party before bouncing 60 feet away, dealing a little necrotic damage to any creatures left in range. Or, if they're really boned up, the Lich might delay their retreat and unleash a 20-foot emanation for even more necrotic damage. If things start going sideways and enemies start getting a little too close, the Lich still has their ability to cast Fear as a legendary action, so it's sure to be a tricky enemy to take down. And if any of your party is unlucky enough to die in their lair, they'll have their soul consumed immediately by the Lich until they can be brought back by True Resurrection or a Wish spell. There's a lot to like here, and the culmination of these changes often amounts to more than just the sum of their parts. But that's even before we take a look at what's outside of the stat block in this new monster manual, so you'll want to watch this video next if you haven't already. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more guides like this, and until next time, go out there and make some chaos.